Thank you guys for letting me do this today. I've been asked to talk about feedback loops for database decision making. And so what I did in putting this presentation together is I went back to the beginning of my role, and my input and my experience with Otis and multi-tiered systems of support, just to kind of talk about what we've gone through historically as a school district. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Sean Beard. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Teaching and Learning at Sandy Springs Public Schools. And what I do directly deals with, obviously, what my title says, teaching and learning, curriculum, textbooks, teacher training. And so a large part of that has to do with professional learning communities and RTI, which are directly tied to MTSS. So to give you a little bit of background about us, the first thing I thought I'd talk about was where we were with data and decision making prior to Otis. I think for many years we did what a lot of districts did. We knew that there needed to be this conversation about how student understanding and the gaps that occur with student learning fed back and informed intervention and instruction. But with all the different programs that there have been over the years historically in education, everybody was in a different spot. A lot of people didn't understand the buzzwords around PLCs and RTI. And so while you might, have the conversation about, like, say, to a group of teachers, you might ask, how does your data from student assessment, CFAs, exit tickets, how does that inform your instruction? A lot of them would say, oh yeah, that directly ties back to what I do. But a lot of them might have been in a different spot from their teacher next door. And so we knew that we had a lot of work to do when it first came to working with multi-tiered systems. And so going forward, we knew that it was going to be a massive undertaking, because for us, we have about 5,000 students across the district. And in that, we have in the classroom roughly about 350 to 375 certified staff. And so when you're talking about making sure that everybody understands how those mechanisms of PLCs and RTI work in the classroom and how that informs your instruction, that's a big undertaking, because you want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And so that's one of the key themes that I'm going to be talking about here in just a few minutes. Beginning with Otis, this was actually prior to my time in this office. Prior to my role, I was the virtual school director. I had been a classroom teacher for 13 years, virtual school director for about 6 years. And then at the time that this took place, I was the IT director. And so a lot of the things that were going on in this point were I was not involved in, but I quickly became involved in it about 2 years later. But what we did as a district, we sent all of our principals, vice principals, and a team of PLC coordinators, which were classroom teachers, through solution tree training. And they received basically RTI at work training. But what they had done is they had gone to a conference. And so, as you know, with conferences, there are different workshops, so different people can sign up for different things. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But they got to hear all the different theories behind RTI and PLC, and then they were going to bring that back, form a district-wide committee, and then at the site level form their guiding coalitions to talk about the work that needed to be done to employ RTI in the classroom. The very first thing that they looked at was, we really need to sit down and determine what our essential standards are. So they divided up the PLC coordinators into subject level teams, and for secondary 6 through 12. So we had the core groups for math, science, ELA, and social studies. And then for elementary, we used PLC coordinators to coordinate with grade level teams, pre-K through 5. With that, discussions were held about essential standards and developing common formative assessments. And then about that same time, that's when we did what a lot of school districts do, and we set up an early release day. Our early release day is Friday, and so that's our collaboration time to work with grade levels and for teachers to sit down and talk about data that's coming back from the common formative assessments to determine how that data is going to inform whether or not they need to intervene or change their instruction. The difficult thing at that time, and I hope I'm not getting ahead of my slide here because I think I talk about this in just a minute, but the difficult thing at that time is that because this was such a massive undertaking, and with any new program, there's this goal to try to get a fast understanding of the system and how it works, and start deploying that quickly. A lot of the things that we were adopting, we were looking at what other districts did, which many people do. There's nothing wrong with that. Having conversations with other districts, trying to understand what they already know, why reinvent the wheel? But one of the things that we had done is look at essential standards that have been chosen by other districts, and then introduce that to teams, and then say, does this look good? So I think that's where, for us, had we done it differently, we might be a little bit further than we are now, but I feel like we're doing a pretty good job now. And that's going to play into some of the other things I'm going to talk about here in terms of feedback. So very quickly, when I came into the role, I had been sort of a fan on the outside watching, because I was the IT director at the time, seeing RTI, seeing all the principles behind multi-tiered systems of support, and but I didn't have direct involvement until I entered my role as assistant superintendent of teaching and learning. What I did then was I started to devour everything I could, books, online materials about RTI. And what I quickly began to realize in working with our teams is I started to see some things that were working and some things that weren't working. And one of the very difficult processes that I had to tackle very first at the beginning in my role was the fact that people that had been trained, that was a one and done. We did that 2 years ago. We're done. Everybody understands. But the problem is you have administrator changes, you have faculty changes. And so when that occurs, you've got to make sure that you have continuous training. One of the things that we would assume from a lot of people that would come on board, especially in an administrator role, is that they already had prior knowledge. And that just wasn't the case all the time. Sometimes it was, but not always. The other thing that I began to realize is that in my role, what I wanted to do was sit down with teachers and talk about PLC and RTI, and the feedback that I was getting in those meetings is that they didn't really understand what it was or how it fit into what they were doing in the classroom. Now, maybe that's because of the buzz terms, like I said, that surround the whole process, because for many years, we've been doing this in education. We've just called it something else. But teachers were basically on a train, and they were riding the train with us, but they didn't really know the destination. And the big thing that I've quickly, realized was that everybody needed to know the why. Why are we doing this? Who is it going to impact? What do we need to be doing differently? What are some things that we're doing now that could change? And so very quickly it became I've got to make sure that they understand the why behind this. The other thing was we needed to agree on what was done during that collaboration time. During early release time, some people were lesson planning. Some people were saying, well, I've got to run to coaching. Or some people were saying, I'm just going to grade papers. We really needed to sit down and say the reason we're doing this early release time is because it factors into the whole process of intervention. And so very quickly, I realized I've got to change some things, sit down with people, talk about it, make sure that our faculty was understanding. Because at this point, administrators and PLC coordinators, that is a very small percentage of our population with the understanding what's going on. Making sure that everybody else, the majority of our faculty, understood was very important. So that took us to the next phase. So where do we go from here? And this is kind of a breakdown of the next 4 slides, just so you know. Like I said, we had that small group of people that understood where we needed to be, but getting the majority of them to understand what it took was a large undertaking. So we sent around surveys. We developed a survey as a district-wide Otis team, and then we shared that with building principals and asked them to talk to their teachers about, what do you do with your early release time? What do you understand about RTI? What do you do in terms of a CFA? What is your understanding of a CFA? What are your understanding of the 3 tiers of instruction? And so surveying them and getting that feedback was the first thing. Second thing is finding the right tools. I'm going to talk about that in just a few minutes, but just as a precursor to that, one thing that I found when I entered my role is that we had over the years acquired way too many tools to address skills practice and intervention. And the difficulty is that different people were using different things, and that became a difficulty, and I'll talk about that. And then the last 2 things will be to provide training, and then finally just sitting down and doing the work, which is a large undertaking in and of itself. And it's, anytime you talk about employing a new system like this, people will tell you that it takes 3 to 5 years. And so that's the majority of it right there. So surveying staff, like I said, we had teachers that were on the train, but they didn't know where we were going with it. And so when we sat down with the survey, we asked them about different pieces of the RTI process, different pieces of collaboration time, and what is a good use of your collaboration time. Some of the feedback that we would get is that, well, we already talk about our kids and how they perform during our planning periods. And sometimes I love that people do that. I love that teachers get together and do those things, but sometimes those meetings are while we're standing out in the hall waiting for kids to pass, from class to class, or, while our kids are at recess, or while our kids are in specials. But often those conversations are just, yeah, I think he's doing pretty well, or no, he's not doing that well, and I don't know what I'm going to do. So it wasn't informed by the data. And so the quick conversation that had to happen is, what drives those conversations? Are we sitting down and establishing guidelines for what we do when we meet? And so we were getting feedback from them that that's not exactly what was happening. We were also getting feedback from teachers saying that some of the forms that we had developed for that collaboration time to kind of guide them through that process, they felt as if they were spending more time filling out the blanks in the form than they were having the conversations. So that meant that we needed to shift the guidelines that we used for that. Moving forward, we started to notice the impact of all the things that were going on in the district. And I talked about finding the right tools. That form for that collaboration time was one of the things that we had to establish in terms of a right tool. And in essence, that tool specifically shifted from being an instrument that they fill out to being a website that establishes what our policies are in terms of MTSS and intervention. And so I'll talk about that one later. But the other thing that was blinding to me, not only from a fiscal standpoint of looking at my budget and how much I'm spending on tools, and when I say tools, I'm talking about all those little online supplementary tools that you use to assist with primary instruction, like IXL, Study Island, Reflex Math, all those different products that are out there that we get hit with every year in terms of, this can provide the data to help your kids out. RSA tools, the screeners that are out there, the benchmarks that we were using in secondary, where RSA doesn't have a direct impact, but we need to still be benchmarking. State assessments, those are a factor too, not that we have a lot of control over, but still yet it's another piece to the puzzle. When it came to student growth and practice, we just had too much. Yes, we needed to have an RSA screener. That's a no-brainer. But we also needed to find a screener or a benchmark tool that we could use for secondary. And we were using one thing for that, but when it came to monitoring kids and seeing how they're progressing with ELA and math specifically, because those were our two areas of focus, some schools were using Study Island, some classrooms were using Study Island, some were using Reflex Math, some were using IXL, and then still yet some were buying separate tools building by building. And the difficulty that comes from that is the inconsistency. When it came to saying like one grade or one subject area as a whole is having difficulty, and trying to figure out where the difficulty lay, and in terms of instruction and things like that, if they weren't using the primary curriculum with fidelity, and if they weren't using a common consistent tool for study and practice, it wasn't going to inform our intervention in the way that we needed it to. So we needed to find a consistent training and consistent access to common tools and make sure that everybody understands what they should be using. Providing the right training was, like I said, very important. At the beginning, all of our administrators and PLC coordinators went through solution tree training. And but like I said, we had people that came in late to the profession. We would hire new assistant principals, new principals. A teacher might move into an administrator role or leave the district and go somewhere else. And as a result, we would lose a PLC coordinator. And that meant that those people needed to be brought up to speed on what RTI was about. So what I now do on an annual basis is, if we hire a new administrator, they go to solution tree training, and they go to an RTI conference. And then likewise, PLC coordinators, they go. One of the difficult things, though, is now that we've been in this, I feel like this is probably our sixth or seventh year doing this. Not everybody's had the same training. And while all the information that you'll get from Solution Tree in terms of books and conferences tells the same story, what I mean by not receiving the same training is the conversations weren't the same. So you might have one person that went to this session and another person that went to another session at a conference, but because they're not there to have that conversation about what they're understanding, sometimes the understanding about how the process works might look and feel a little bit different. So one of the things that we did this year at the beginning of the school year, prior to the start, we had all of our administrators and all of our PLC coordinators in one room, and we brought in a trainer on RTI to give us a refresher, so that as we talked through it and as we discussed what this needs to look like as a district, we were all circling back and getting back on track to the same conversation, the same page. The other thing is, and this is the vast majority of the people, our teachers had not received formal training. And in trying to figure out how to make that work, what I started doing in the 2021 school year was having district-wide meetings. Each semester, I would meet with every subject level team and every grade level team, and we would talk through different pieces of MTSS and PLCs and what that looked like. And so some of the topics that you're seeing here are things that we talked about. Very beginning, very start, I talked to them about the PLC process, and I talked to them about the 3 tiers of instruction and developing essential standards and unwrapping those standards and developing a CFA to address those skills that are those strands that are in those standards. And then moving forward after that, then we would talk about, what does tier 1 look like for you? What are some best practices? A lot of that had to do with classroom environment. And in the process of doing each of these conversations with teachers, I tried to employ some of the same practices that I had as a classroom teacher, and I would ask questions and I would try to get feedback from them. And we had CFAs. We had little pieces where they could respond with their phones and during the conversation, so that I could get feedback from them to understand what they did and didn't understand. it was important to have those conversations because it really opened my eyes in terms of, yeah, we know we're supposed to do collaboration time on Friday, but we're just not sure what to do with it. Or I know I need to develop a CFA, but what does that look like? And um, so that opened up our eyes, and we still continue to do that, but it's changed slightly now, because over the past 3 years, we went through these conversations, but now our conversation has changed a little bit, and I'll talk about that in just a minute as well. Doing the work was the fourth thing that I said that is going to be the very hard part. Talking to teachers about essential standards, one of the things that I found is that because we had looked at what other districts had done, and adopted some of those things, the teachers didn't have buy-in. They didn't have ownership in what was established in the past. When I would show them essential standards, they would say, "Those aren't my standards. We didn't put those together." And so what we now do as a district, is each year when we go through the textbook adoption process, like right now we're going through math adoption, and we're trying to determine which curriculum we want to choose for the next 5 years. As soon as we've done that, as soon as we've established what curriculum we're going to purchase for math, then we will set up a summer training. And part of that summer training will be, bringing in the textbook publisher and training the teachers on how to access the curriculum, what their textbooks will look like, what the online content will look like. But it's also spending time going back and looking at the standards again. Your standards, your essential standards, are a living, breathing thing that you touch on every day. And it's healthy to have a regular conversation about those standards, but it's difficult. So textbook adoption seemed like a normal step in the process, in the chain, to have to go back and refresh that conversation from time to time. And so we review essential standards. Are these the standards that we still feel are important to classroom instruction? Is this something that we need to change? And we have the conversation about the sheer number of standards that they have to cover in a year versus what we know are essential, and things that spiral, and things that need to be addressed as prior knowledge. And then we unpack those standards. We also use that time to develop pacing calendars, and then we discuss development of CFAs and what tools they're using and how they can get that information back. And as part of that process, one of the things that you're seeing here in the right-hand side of the slide, and if I change that to this website, are you seeing that website? Okay, so this website was developed alongside the process so that as we readdress standards and pacing, we will post that on this website. And this is an internal website. It's not open to the public, but it's only open to our teachers and administration. So we will upload the essential standards, the pacing calendar, and then we also link that back to the tools that we're using for intervention and skill practice. And that's something that we'll be updating this year for math. And by putting that out there, and also by putting out on that same website the parts of our PLC process and what we envision as a district, teachers can go back, especially new teachers. That's important. All of this transparency, all of this knowledge is there so that if a veteran teacher that's been with us for years needs to go back and look at that again, they can. If we have a new teacher that's coming to the profession, they can see that, and they can, have the conversations with teachers, the veteran teachers, and say, where can I find my standards? Where can I find my pacing calendar? And that's a quicker conversation now because it's already laid out. It's right there. So that's very helpful in terms of incoming teachers. That's some of the feedback that I would get from those sessions, though. When we would have training sessions about RTI, some of the teachers are like, I know we have a pacing calendar, but I think so-and-so has that. And so when they would bring it out, somebody else would say, well, that's not the pacing calendar we agreed on. So part of that work in the transparency is saying, we're going to develop this together. And when it's done, we're going to put it on that website. And when you have a question, you need to go refer to that website. I've also kind of locked it down so that nobody can change those. And if a change does need to occur, I ask that they run it through our office so that we can make that change globally instead of behind the scenes where not everybody has access to it. So that became very important to us as well. So what's the result of all these unified practices? In looking at all the information that we got from surveys and having conversations as a team and having conversations with Dr. Duhan and then with our PLC coordinators and those subject area and grade level teams, one of the things that I quickly realized is that we needed to put those two pieces together that I just showed you, the PLC page, the teaching and learning portal that has all of those pacing calendars and essential standards. Outlining the policy for our district beliefs. In having that conversation with Dr. Duhan, I was like, well, I kind of feel like we already know, but it made total sense to put it down in writing. And, what I quickly realized in terms of this presentation today is that I need to go back and update that this week because we've had some staff changes and some of the people that are listed in there are different. But again, revisiting those processes becomes important and providing the right guidance for the teachers so that they know where they need to be. It's very interesting now to have conversations with teachers and say, what am I supposed to do next? Well, it's in the pacing calendar. Don't forget, go look at the teaching and learning portal. What is it like for a new teacher entering our district? When we have new teacher training, we show them that website and say, definitely have conversations with your department, but this is where you'll go. This is your key start to find your standards, to find the pacing calendar. All that is laid out, and it makes it much more simple for a new teacher entering into the profession, and also somebody that's coming in from another district that doesn't know the way we've done it here in our district. As far as tools, when it came to benchmarks, yes, for RSA purposes, we had a common benchmark that we used for elementary, but for secondary, we had shifted over the years to many different things. And one of the things that I would get in feedback and talking from teacher to teacher is saying, I know you use this for elementary, but when we get to secondary, I don't have access to that tool. So I don't know as a 6th grade teacher how that 5th grader had been performing. And so one of the shifts that I made as far as that feedback is we now use IXL pre-K through 12 for all 4 core areas. And because we use NWEA which is map growth for some of you, if you're not used to NWEA, you call it map growth. Because we use map growth, we can upload all of our RIT scores for RSA and for ELA and math into IXL, and that informs study skill plans in IXL. And because that's being used in the elementary and it's also being used in secondary, all that data follows the child. And so it doesn't matter if you're an elementary teacher, a middle school teacher, or a high school teacher, you can go back and look globally and see as that child's progressed through IXL, how they've been performing on benchmarks and how they've shown student growth. So that was very important to us. Instead of having so many tools and saying, I don't know where to find that, we now have shifted to go look in IXL. Now, that's not to say that anybody needs to use that product. I'm just saying that's the product that we've chosen. It's important that you find something that's consistent that everyone can turn to that provides fidelity to the process. And so whatever tool you choose, that's really something the district has to decide, but it needs to be a common thing. Special education impact, one of the huge things that talking with our special ed director yesterday, and we both agreed on, is that this whole process of feedback and conversations has uncovered a need for us to have a dedicated SPED curriculum for intervention with our SPED students. And so we've been using really great reading for many years, but we never had a math product. And so this last year we adopted Do the Math as a tool that we would use in SPED. And what we're finding is that with really great reading, yes, kids in SPED are making some rapid gains. But now with Do the Math, we're seeing some equally, and just in the short time we've been using it, rapid gains in math. So that's always been something that when I was early in my role, I would get calls and saying, can we buy this? We don't really have anything. Now we've shifted to, we have a new teacher, we need to put them on really great reading or Do the Math. And so again, common tools and having some integrity behind the program has been huge and massively important. Testing and growth, by having that single tool for progress monitoring and practice, by having IXL, one of the other things that was very important is knowing that the curriculum that we bought would tie back to the tool. And so one of the things that you'll notice, like I said earlier, is IXL skill plans are attached to the website where we can find our curriculum and our pacing calendars. We chose IXL in this case because it, like many other products, had skill plans based on the curriculum we were using. And because of those skill plans, teachers can now assign practice to students based on the unit that they're doing. Those skill plans have helped us to monitor the growth of students. It's one thing to look at achievement. When you look at achievement, you're looking at a single solitary state score from an assessment in the spring, or you might be looking at a benchmark 3 times a year. But what is the most important in our mind and getting feedback from these conversations is that yes, I can see where they were at that time in that little snapshot, but what's going on between time? And so by using a common tool, we can see the growth that's occurring between fall to winter to spring, between spring of 22 to spring of 23 to spring of 24. Seeing that growth is important in the tools that we're using. Another thing that we've shifted to is a lot of teachers have said it's really difficult for us to pull data out of these systems, but also we're having to look back and find, is that child on an IEP? So we're pulling data out of this tool, but we're having to go back to the student information system and find other data in another tool. And how many absences has this child had, and how is that informing what's going on? So we recently adopted a tool called Schoollytics. There are tons of different tools out there that do the same thing that I'm about to describe, but this is a data dashboard that receives data from our student information system and from our screener and from our skill practice tool, and it puts it all in one place. And so as you're looking at charts of student performance and student growth, you can also quickly click on an icon in a data chart and pull up a list of those kids and see if they've been chronically absent, to see if they're on an IEP, to see if they have a 504. So getting that data is important, and that's a new tool for us. And in talking with teachers, they're very excited about being able to have all of that in one place so that they can do their job much more efficiently. And again, all this comes from conversation. If we don't have these conversations, we don't find out the difficulties that they're having, it can't help me as an administrator decide where to go next in terms of purchasing and adopting the tools into practice. So, but communication, I kind of already said that. The massive way that I've seen the importance behind this is scheduling communication. You can't let communication just be word of mouth. So we have monthly meetings with our PLC leads, and we have biweekly meetings with our leadership, actually. But we still have monthly meetings with the district-wide, we still call it the Otis team. And then as a lead into that, in those conversations, we talk about what we're going to converse with our teachers on. What do our teachers need to know? In the past, I told you that what I did in each semester was provide training to them to get feedback from them about the PLC process. We're kind of past that now, and now we're at a place of giving them consistent training and consistent feedback of what's important to know now. And so as we meet with them, like August, we talked about back to school. Where do you find your tools? What's the window for your benchmark for the year? In September, we talked about reminding teachers to have that conversation about why we're an RTI district. I actually had some veteran teachers email me back after that one and say, why are we still talking about this? I already know that. And I said, the reason we need to do that conversation is because you have new people in your midst that don't know that conversation. And so you have that knowledge, they don't. And so by having those conversations every September, we can discuss why we're an RTI district and what that means to you so that the new people know how that fits into our process. October, we talk about, the fall benchmark is over. So how do we reflect on that data? Where will we find those reports? What kind of reports can you pull? November, we talked about skill practice and tiered intervention. January, we just talked about pulling reports to compare fall and winter benchmark results and where to find those growth reports, where to find those achievement results. And then going forward, we'll talk about, benchmarks and then continuing to use the student growth tools. And then in March, we'll talk about testing. But we will leave it this way. You'll notice we don't do anything in December and we don't do anything in April, May because of testing. But we'll continue to do this on a monthly basis every year, providing that common conversation, common approach to training. And then again, in the summertime, training up teachers and getting them to have the conversations again about essential standards and pacing. I think by doing that, we've now entered a flow where everybody's getting closer to the same page, or at least on the same page as far as this process. So basically for me, for us as a conclusion, as a district, primarily the biggest thing was ensuring that everybody understands the why. That was something I found out really quickly. 10% of the district knew the why, 90% didn't, and we had to fix that. So I think we're in a much better place, but we're still working on that. And that's a continuous process that doesn't stop because you're always going to have turnover in your faculty. Consistent and continual training. The feedback gave me that information that teachers said, yeah, I know we have that tool, or some said, I didn't know we had that tool. And so by providing consistent training on RTI, but also on the tools that we use to impact RTI, it's hugely important. Treating the system as a living thing that you go back and you treat regularly. A living thing's got to be fed, a living thing's got to be checked up on. Your essential standards have to be checked on, and you have to have those conversations regular, and people have to be fed that knowledge so that they know how it impacts them. So training and supporting everyone involved, teacher to admin to support, everybody needs to know what they need to know. And so will we do a refresher as a group, as a central team? Yes, we'll continue to do that probably every couple of years. As new people come in, we're definitely going to make sure that they get RTI training. And then the big thing for me, like I said earlier, consistent tools to ensure the integrity of our program, making sure that we know where those tools are, we're using a common tool, and we're not using a scattered menu of different things and then not understanding how that impacts what we do. Now having those common tools and going back to it feeds the integrity of what we have in terms of conversations when we meet for collaboration. So, and that's basically all I have. So what questions do you guys have?
Sean, you did a super job. It's a great presentation. It's a ton of information in there. And I've got a few questions if you're willing to entertain me.
Sure.
So you one of the things I want to make a note. One of the things you said is in your presentation, you mentioned a phrase, and I really love that phrase. You said, notice the impact. And what that tells me about the way Sand Springs and you approach problems is you not only provide the support, you see if it changed something, right? You
Yeah.
notice whether or not, okay, we spent this money, we did this new thing, we bought this new tool. Are people using it? Are people or are we seeing better outcomes for our kids? Is that one thing you see a lot of need for, is to follow up, and how do you best follow up on implementation of new practices? Or even, I know I recall your website, your written plan built into that website, which is again a great tool as a living document, like you said. Do you track when people access it? How do you know who's doing what and not? How do you track that integrity at big picture level?
So because that site, the way it's built, I don't really have a way to track views on it. I would love to find a way to do that, and that's something I work on. I don't know how many people view it, but I do make sure that at the beginning of the year we remind people where those things are and direct them to it, face to face as much as we can. But a lot of the other tools, I did notice when it comes to our skill practice tools and our curricular tools, um, even though everybody, in administration and faculty knew, yes, we have that tool, I don't think the administrators always knew how to find the actionable results and the information that they needed from those tools. They have a lot of things to take care of throughout the year. The laundry list of things from safety to instruction to scheduling and master schedule, all those things take precedent. And then, oh yeah, I have to go back and look at this. And when you don't give them that insight and that training on how to find that information, it kind of leaves them just as lost as I would be. So some of the tools that we use give us the ability to go look and say, this is the level of teacher engagement. These are the teachers that are accessing it. This is how much this teacher has accessed it. This is how much the kids have accessed it. And then the tools like Schoolitics, which is that data dashboard, that was an important piece to understanding how many people are using these tools. So much more so than just a benchmark, but also like a regular practice tool to supplement their instruction. So, you often assume if everybody gets that training in August or July, that in that hour long, or maybe even if it's a 2-day training, you kind of have that assumption that everybody understood it, and they don't always understand it. I don't always understand something when I'm just sitting in a meeting. And so one of the things that I didn't mention that our superintendent does with our leaders is she has regular checkpoint meetings with them. And one of the questions that we ask them is, how's the PLC process going? Now I having trouble using these tools, and we'll show them where to access those reports. So I hope that answered the question.
No, that's great. I'm going to ask a little bit harder question because I know we struggle with some of these things. You talked about aligning your data systems and aligning your resources, and that was one thing you said was like a big hurdle in terms of getting everybody using the same curriculum, using the same tools, using the same resources. How did you deal with the pushback? I'm assuming you got some pushback on that. How'd you deal with that?
It was hard because initially, my knee-jerk reaction was, I'm going to find a tool and we're just going to use it. But you can't do that because there was, at the time when I counted, we had 4 tools that would address math and ELA. And when not everyone is consistently using the same tool, you couldn't point your finger and say, there's the problem, because if you're trying to assess like a grade level, where is a grade level having concerns, and all of your data points are coming from different things, it's difficult to point the finger and assign blame on understanding of one thing. And some of the tools that I would have thought that we would, say, let's get rid of that, that's a favorite tool. And when, as a teacher, you use that tool on a regular basis to say, I love that tool, don't take that tool away from me, that's a real conversation. Somebody came and took your car away from you and that's your favorite car, you're going to fight. And so I spent a year and a half, and that was a long time to sit back and wait for this process to happen. But I took a year and a half of conversations in some of those PLC meetings, surveys. We did 2 or 3 surveys asking teachers, how often do you use this tool? How do you use this tool? Have you ever used this other tool? We listed all of them, and what I did along the way is I was very direct and very real in saying the results of these surveys over the course of the year and a half are going to determine what we keep and what we unload. And at the end, I still had some pushback, and I said, I understand. However, What is it you love about this tool that we're losing? And they would tell me, and I would show them, okay, for the tool that the majority of your peers have chosen, here's how you find that same piece in this tool, because a lot of the tools are very similar. Don't get me wrong. And so sometimes that favorite piece could be found in another place, and they just didn't know it was there. So it was a year and a half process of surveying and conversations, and then just getting everybody trained and making sure they understood, where can I find my favorite pieces in this new tool. So
yeah, that's tough. It really is. You're moving
yeah,
people's cheese and it upsets them.
I
I
didn't
want to
have any
ask.
flat tires or anything over it.
Yeah,
So,
that's good. I'm sure there was some contemplation.
yeah,
I'm going to ask two more questions and I promise I'll shut up. But I think these are important for people to hear your answers to.
sure.
Uh, Looking back, what are the mistakes that we made and what are the best decisions that we made at Sand Springs as a district?
I think some of the things that I talked about very early on, one mistake, this is nobody's fault, and I actually meant to say this before, doing this, implementing this kind of process district wide is massively difficult. And, you can't blame anybody for any path that they took in trying to get to where we were. But I think one mistake that I noticed that I wouldn't have even thought was a mistake at the time is having everybody attend a choose your own adventure type of conference where everybody gets to pick and choose which workshops they go to. Um, and the way I realized that mistake is that when I finally went to training on RTI, the group that I went with, we chose a conference where everyone was in the same room with one presenter, and we spent 3 days on RTI, and we had conversations about what it looks like for our school. Everybody has to be on the same page, and everybody has to have the same understanding. And if somebody misunderstands something that's said in training, you need to address it and make sure of that, because we would have situations where one school would be doing it one way and another would be doing it another way, because in the initial training, the administrator or the faculty members understood something different than the other site. So making sure that we got the right training. And then another mistake that is just a mistake that a lot of districts make, we're guilty of it, and I know a lot of others are, is that when you have faculty that come to you and say, hey, I want to buy this, can we buy this and add this to what we do? And not having that very real conversation of, I understand that you want that tool, but how are you using the current tools that we have in our disposal? What are you currently doing? And having that very real conversation of, well, I'm not using that tool, I just like this better, has to be had. And it's not comfortable all the time, because you want to have integrity behind your practices. And while there are tons of great tools out there, finding that one that fits and finding one that you can return to for consistency of data is important. I feel like those are the two biggest things that were a hurdle for us. And it's taken the entirety of my role in the past 5 years to kind of get through that.
All right, what are the best decisions you made?
Doing those two things. While those were the two biggest mistakes, I think that the hardship behind those two were the best. But apart from those two things, fixing those two processes and providing the training and the consistency of tools, is meeting with teachers. I think the best decision, although it seemed kind of difficult and arduous, and people were like, why are we meeting with Sean for 2 hours on a Wednesday twice a semester to talk about? And we did that at first, and then I scaled it back to smaller meetings, but meeting regularly with our teachers to kind of get them updated on the RTI process, and then still continuing to stand on the shoulders of the PLC coordinators and have them convey information in a continual basis, has been valuable. Because if your teachers don't have buy-in to the process, and if the teachers don't have buy-in to the tools that you're using, it's not going to be effective. They have to understand the why behind it, and they have to understand and say, yes, I get it, and I'll do that. Otherwise, your data is going to be all over the place, and the consistency of use and the impact on the child is going to be different from classroom to classroom.
So good shared understanding, good shared knowledge base across the board. And like you said earlier, that takes continuous action. You can't just
It
do it
never
once
stops.
and yeah, it never stops. And I think that's great. One of the things we're actually talking about the summer MTSS conference now. And I'm going to bring in the idea that you just talked about, having some time for groups that come to process that information, because that
Yeah.
you're right, that's critical. And we don't really always give time for that because we want to stuff the conference with content, but we've got to give the people who are there time to process the information together.
Yeah. And you know, time is a factor in that regard. I get that. And that's one of the difficult hurdles that we've had through our 7-year process, is that where do you find the time to do all those things? Finding the time to process it, absorb it, and then have conversations about it is important. So yeah.
Well, thanks for what you did here, Sean, today, and thanks for what you do at Sand Springs. And I will not ask another question, I promise.
You're good. You know, you can always ask. I can't always say I'm going to have the right answers, but
I got your number, man.
you got my number. That's right. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate the time to do this today.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time and presenting. This was awesome. I know our districts are going to absolutely love this content. So thank you so much.
All right.
All right.
I shared a copy of my slideshow with Dr. Duhan, so if you guys need it,
Okay.
absolutely feel free to share it. So
All right. Thank you so much.
you guys have a great
Bye,
day.
Sean.
Bye.
Bye.